question A and questions similar to it have a high probability of making little mental math errors. So a couple helpful notes or helpful hints. One, think of the absolute value bars as brackets. And if you think of them as brackets, when you're doing order of operations, you simplify just like brackets. You simplify inside of them first. Right? And secondly, once you've simplified inside first, once you've simplified it, you're going to have a single number. And then you can actually apply the absolute value. And what I'm going to say is we're going to remove those absolute values, apply the absolute values, and replace them with brackets. So what does that mean, and what are some other things you have to be careful with absolute values? Okay? So we're only going to remove absolute values once you have a single number inside of them. But we also have to be careful because absolute values are not like brackets. Do you know what's the nice thing about brackets? They're bent, right? And the other one's bent the other way, so they sort of close each other off. Absolute value bars are straight up and down, so sometimes it's hard to see where one starts and where one ends. I've seen students make a mistake in this one where they go, ooh, I have the absolute value of -2. I'm going to make that +2. But do you see that that -2 is actually not in an absolute value bar? Even though it looks like it, if you just look at the close by it, it looks like it is. So sometimes what I do with these ones is I do a little bit of color coding. This absolute value bar starts there. Where does it end? Here. And then I go to a different color and say this absolute value bar starts there and ends there. So the -2 is not actually in absolute value bars because the purple and the orange ones are like different sets of brackets. So now what we're going to do is we're going to simplify first inside those ones. So I'm going to still color code here. Inside the purple ones, I would have -26 plus 13. That would give me -13. And then I still have the -2. And then inside my orange ones, 10 minus 6 would give me, whoops, color coding almost. There we go. -6. So helpful hint number 1, I think of those absolute values as brackets and I simplify them first. Helpful hint number 2, we're going to remove the absolute values once you have a single number. I have a single number inside of that -13. I'm going to change those absolute values to just regular brackets. And what is the absolute value of 13? -13? +13, right? Because an absolute value changes a number to positive. Sometimes the brackets aren't necessary, and sometimes they're very important. Another mistake so I have that as a helpful hint to replace it with brackets. It's not always necessary. Like, I could have just written 13 here. Would have been fine. But getting into the practice of let's put brackets in there temporarily just to make sure I don't miss anything. Because sometimes you miss, oh, I had to multiply and I thought I had to add, or different kind of operations get missed. So I'm going to replace that absolute value with brackets. I'm going to replace these absolute values with brackets. And what's the absolute value of -6? It's +6. And now you have math like grade 9 math. You see like that -2 outside the brackets? That's going to be multiplication. So order of operations, this 13 doesn't need the brackets. I can just write 13. But then I'm going to have -12, and 13 minus 12 is 1. Okay? So the number one thing that sometimes gets tricky in these is if you try to, you can never make things positive early until you have a single number in it. Right? So a common mistake is someone says, ooh, I'll just make this a plus 26, or I'll just make this a plus 16 in between, because absolute values make things positive. They do once you have a single number inside. If you try to do it too early, right, and you see if I change this 26 to a positive right away, then I get 39 in there. And that's not the right value. So we think of them as brackets, simplify them to a single number first, and then very nice to change them to brackets, even though sometimes you don't need them, but you really did need them here. If you didn't put those orange brackets here, I've seen students think, oh, this is now the number 26. Well, no, it's supposed to be 2 times 6. All right, so let's look at B. B is actually, I think, a little bit easier. B just says, evaluate this. If I color code this, I only have one set of absolute value bars. So in color coding it, I didn't really need to color code it because there's only one set. And we're replacing the x with a 2, so that's going to be negative 2 times 2 squared minus 3 times 2 minus 4. Again, we can't change those negatives to positives because we first need to simplify. So I have my absolute value bars still here. I'm going to do this. This is going to be 4 times negative 2 is negative 8 minus 6 minus 4, which makes negative 18. And then the absolute value of negative 18 is positive 18. So circle questions 12, 13, and 14.